It had been a hot and humid August, but as we drew into the last quarter of it, the days began to cool off. We were also starting to see 2 or 3 days of rain per week. That meant it was time to head up to Mushroom Camp. Mushroom Camp is a spot Daphne and I go and hunt for mushrooms back deep in an old hemlock forest. Old forests are among the best places to forage, and we were eager to get there. But it was a slow hike. The beauty along the way was breathtaking, and Daphne couldn't help but stop and eat blackberries every chance she got. The unusually hot summer and the wealth of rains that had followed in late August made for an abundant blackberry harvest. Many decades ago, a region well beyond the old forest had been logged. Happily, the loggers are long since gone, but the old road that they left, now little more than a trail, is maintained by homesteaders and a few ATV enthusiasts. It's very rarely used though. For years and years we've been coming here and we've never seen a soul. The first order of business is pitching camp. Fortunately, Daphne and I have decades of experience at this, and it went very quickly. While I have a selection of tents available back at the cottage, we rarely ever use them. It's hard to find so much as a square foot of level ground in the forests of the maritime provinces, so normally we just camp in hammocks. Daphne and I are coming up on our 28th anniversary, and his and her hammock seems like a great way to celebrate it. In moments, the hammocks are pitched and it's time to settle in and enjoy the coming night. An eerie red moon rose that night. At first I thought the color was the result of a lunar eclipse, but it didn't fade. It turned out this eerie moon was the result of smoke in the atmosphere from forest fires out west. We drank wine and chatted easily there in the darkling wood, until at last Daphne drifted to her bed. But for me, the evening's work was just getting started. I brewed a cup of tea, then began to set up the cameras. It's my hope to catch sounds of some of the nighttime wildlife. Coyotes, bobcats, American black bears, martens, and many owls all call this forest home. While I wait, I can't help but capture images of the local fungi. Have you ever wondered what the fungi get up to at night when they think nobody's looking? And there it is, just what I was hoping to capture on audio. An owl has moved into the area, but it sounds to be between 50 and 100 meters off, and when I turn the gain up on the mic enough to really catch it well, it also amplifies the sound of the brook. What you're hearing is the sound of the owl with the brook sound filtered out. The distortion of the filter working so hard makes for an interesting effect, as if there are voices in the forest. However, the sound you're hearing of the owl is pretty true to the original. Isn't it magical? Mission accomplished. It's time to head to bed myself. We're going to make an early start in the morning. To forage the best mushrooms, one must rise early. We leave a Yucco candle lantern burning through the night to discourage visits from curious raccoons or American black bears trying to get into our food supply. In the glade at the edge of the forest, all is quiet except for the songs of night birds. Tomorrow, Daphne and I will split and go different ways. She'll go out to that glade and harvest those abundant blackberries, while I keep to the forest in search of mushrooms. Dawn comes, still and cold, and even the birds of the dawn chorus are keeping to their warm nest just now. On the other hand, I love the cold, so I get up, make a cup of tea for Daphne and I, start breakfast, and while the tea steeps, I grab a camera and start filming. Mushrooms grow so fast. Even in the still of the night they were coming up, and mushrooms that I noticed yesterday that were only buds are already becoming large, with well-formed stipes and pileases. That's the caps and stems to the non-mushroomer. I'm mesmerized by the beauty of this little river and descend down the slope to take a closer look. The colors of the forest at dawn, reflecting on the still waters, are beautiful beyond description. And the brook itself is a source of much food for an average forager. and the ancient trees at the bank stretch out over the brook to gather the sun, while the roots form amazing architecture as they plunge into the earth. Fungi are everywhere, such as these tiny colorful mushrooms that seem to prefer to grow in sphagnum moss. As a rule, I avoid harvesting tiny mushrooms as they're very difficult to distinguish one from another, and some can contain deadly amatoxins. Here, a deadly pair of destroying angels rises from the forest duff. Here's a tiny group of colorful fungi. There are tens of thousands of species of tiny fungi, and most of them have never been studied. Mycologists simply refer to them as LBMs, which stands, officially, for little brown mushrooms. Ah, now here's something I've been looking for, a nice edible bolete growing hidden in this rotten log. The morning sun makes its first appearance over the aged trees, bringing with it a touch of warmth to the morning at last. Lecterius piperatus, also known as peppery milky, is a common mushroom here in the Sold Forest. While technically edible, its name piperatus refers to its peppery flavor. It is very hot on the tongue. And here are some edible coral fungi growing off deadwood on the ground. I pause and laugh at myself as I realize I was so enamored with the forest beauty and my hunt for edible mushrooms that I didn't notice all the ostrich ferns growing along the banks of this little river. I know where I'll be harvesting delicious fiddleheads next spring, and this is the Rusula emetica, the vomit mushroom. You can tell by the pale red cap. But growing right beside it is one of those rewards we've been looking for. This is the Lexinum scabrum, the birch bolete, and it is one of my favorite edibles. And just above it, we have another cluster of peppery milkies growing. Meanwhile, above that, we see Daphne striking camp. She must be eager to go out and get her quota of blackberries. Now here's an interesting shelf mushroom that I've seen turning up in the last few years around here, and honestly I'm not familiar with this one. It's toothed and pale and looks a bit like a sulfur shelf, though it isn't. Looks like I startled a red squirrel coming down out of the trees for his breakfast, though. It's okay, little fellow. I'll be moving along. This old tree is covered with aged Termates versicolor, the turkey tail mushroom. It's a very healthy mushroom, good to make tea out of, as good as chaga in my opinion. Unfortunately, they're much too old to use. Growing right nearby is a patch of delicious Rusula brevipiece, which sometimes turns into the delicious lobster mushroom. Both are edible and choice. The patch went on and on. When you get right down to it though, mushrooming is about a lot more than just foraging delicious edible and useful medicinal mushrooms. It's about the beauty of the land. Mushrooming draws you close to meadow and woods in a way little else does. You have to be so careful, so attuned to be able to spot them because often they're very good at hiding. And I find that developing this attunement makes one much more aware of the beauty all around and what it all means. For example, I know that saponins from trees have turned into natural surfactants that eddy as foam now in this brook. This foam clears the water and cleans it, making the water pure and viable to support species that are very dependent upon purity, such as this brook trout. I came across a group of chokecherries that were so laden with cherries that I couldn't help but stop and take some time to gather them. Daphne makes a wonderful chokecherry jelly, but I appear to have startled a red hawk that was roosting nearby, and he's none too happy with my presence. I bet he or she has a nest up in those trees nearby. So I'll gather a bag full of cherries and move on pretty quickly and create as little disturbance as possible, and that way the red-tailed hawk can get back to his nest. We find several kinds of wild cherries in the forests of Atlantic Canada. There's the chokecherry, the black cherry, and the pin cherry. Typically I ignore the small pin cherries, since cherries are so abundant I can be picky, and I'll go after only choke cherries or even better black cherries. This year the trees are particularly laden down with fruit. It's been a very good year for cherries. We found that freezing the cherries and then thawing them and turning them into jelly or wine, whatever we're going to do with them from there, actually helps to improve the flavor. I believe the freezing takes away from the natural bitterness of wild cherries. I have to admit, I was excited when I came across this gigantic bolete, but I soon realized this is one of the species that turns blue when pressed and cut. So I left this one. It may have been an edible. Some boletes that turn blue are in fact edible, but since all the poisonous ones also turn blue when they're crushed or cut, I chose to leave this one. There are so many species of bolete, why chance it? In this little demonstration you can see how quickly some boletes will turn blue when pinched. However, bear in mind, this is an exception. Many boletes take a couple of hours to turn blue. As a rule, leave them alone. And here are some lovely little brown mushrooms growing in the sphagnum moss. And this is Boletus edulis, the prince of edible mushrooms. And right beside it, the pigskin mushroom, a toxic puffball. Avoid these. They turn black on the inside just before they go to spore. And here we have Armillaria melia, the honey mushroom. These gilled mushrooms are easily distinguished because they grow in thick clumps as if attached to one another. Here we have Clavulinopsis fusiformis. That mouthful is often more commonly known as the fairy club. This is an interesting edible. It's bitter to taste, but it's very popular in Nepalese food. I like it mixed into pasta or tart omelets, where I find the acidity cancels out the bitterness and adds something extra special and interesting. Not all happy stories today. Here I've come across a den of wasps that looks like it was dug up by an American black bear. Black bears like to dig them up and eat the larvae, and the wasps too if they can catch them. They don't seem to mind the sting. I know many people don't like wasps, but everything in the forest has its place in the ecosystem. But this nest is far too gone. These wasps won't survive more than a few more of the cold nights ahead. And here we have another delectable bolete sequestered in another stump. I almost passed this one by. I'm glad I didn't. Its condition was perfect. Boletes are my favorite wild edible mushroom, and anytime I go foraging, these are always tip-top on my things to look for. Among the stipe and pileus mushrooms, these are easily distinguished by their spongy undersides that do not turn blue when pinched or cut. And finally, after a day of foraging, the sun is moving low into the west. It's time to call it a day and head back to the cottage and dry and store all this abundance from nature's pantry.